Down in those dim, echo-filled garages in California and Michigan, while everyone else was busy chasing headlines, there was this one dude quietly gearing up for a fight nobody even knew was coming. Phil Remington wasn't loud, didn't care about cameras, didn't need applause. He was just that guy who could look at a pile of metal and somehow see a win hiding inside it. While the big names were talking strategy and shaking hands, Remington was out there grinding, literally, making sure Ford didn't go down in flames. What people don't realize is that the GT40 wasn't born in some fancy boardroom. It was built with busted knuckles, metal shavings stuck in shirts, and Remington refusing to let the car die. And right when everyone thought the program was finally on track, he spotted a disaster nobody else had even noticed. One tiny flaw that could have blown the whole thing apart and handed Ferrari the win on a silver platter. Most folks would have panicked. Remington. He just locked in, fixed the whole mess overnight like it was nothing, and sent the team back out ready to throw punches. That's the part of the 1966 victory nobody talks about. Ford got the glory, the 1-2-3 finish, the movie moments. Shelby and Miles became legends. But the guy who literally held that dream together with skill, instinct, and pure stubbornness, that was Phil Remington, the man who saved the race before it even started and almost got erased from the story. Remington wasn't some polished corporate mascot or magazine cover hero. He was that dude with rough hands and a stare that could read metal the way a doctor reads x-rays. When Ford's plan to buy Ferrari blew up in a storm of ego and insults, the message came down fast and loud: build something that'll crush them, no excuses. That mission landed straight into the laps of Carroll Shelby and his wild crew of American builders, racers, and backyard geniuses. And inside that chaos, one name didn't need to shout to earn respect: Remington. This man had lived a lifetime in speed. He'd watched hot rods tear through SoCal nights, worked on machines that helped shape racing after the war, and learned that surviving a race wasn't about throwing horsepower at a problem. It was about making sure the car could stay alive when everything around it tried to tear it apart. So when Ford's GT program kicked off and the first GT40s showed up looking quick but dying young, nobody was surprised. Yeah, they could fly down the straight, but they'd fold on the next corner. Transmissions shredded, brakes cooked themselves, engines choked out. The European teams laughed like America was playing out of its league. But Remington didn't waste a breath on what anyone said. He just watched, calm, patient, locked in. Where others saw busted parts, he saw clues. Every exploded gearbox was like the car whispering what it needed. Every melted brake pad was a secret waiting to be cracked. While executives stressed over headlines, Remington was elbow-deep inside the GT40, tearing things apart, welding them back better, shaping pieces like he already knew how they'd behave at 200 mph. He had this weird sixth sense for how to make a machine breathe when it was under impossible pressure. And in that gloomy shop, with rain smacking the metal roof like a drumline, he wasn't just fixing a car, he was building a whole new attitude. A different kind of beast. The kind only American grit could create. By the time 65 rolled around, the GT40 was getting better, sure, but Le Mans didn't care about better. That race was a 24-hour grinder that destroyed both dreams and budgets, and Ford's money alone wasn't gonna save them from that. Reliability wasn't something Ford could just throw money at. It had to be earned with sweat, busted knuckles, and way too many nights where nobody went home. And this is where Phil Remington really showed what he was made of. Instead of obsessing over making the GT40 louder or meaner, he focused on making it think. His brain worked like a commander planning a battle, figuring out where the weak spots were and hitting them before they could hit back. Ferrari didn't just win because their cars were quick. They had crazy endurance, perfect pit stops, and a level of precision that looked almost robotic. The Italians could fix or swap a part before most teams even finished shouting for tools. Meanwhile, Ford was losing chunks of time every time the car rolled in. Remington stared at the whole mess like he was solving a puzzle. That heavy American V8 meant hotter brakes, more stress, and way longer pit stops. So he cooked up an idea nobody expected: a quick swap brake setup. Basically, it let the crew rip off burnt brake pads and slap fresh ones in faster than anyone thought possible, using a mounting trick that clicked in and out almost like a rifle mechanism. It was bold, stupidly clever, and a straight-up gut punch to Ferrari's advantage. And it wasn't just luck, it came from Remington's whole life of fixing things under crazy pressure. Between aircraft work and racing chaos, he'd learned that the team who adapts fastest usually walks away with the trophy. Once Shelby's guys tested the system, everyone knew they were holding something special. They even started calling them Phil's brakes behind the scenes, not officially of course, because Remington wasn't the type to brag or chase headlines. He didn't care who got the spotlight, he cared about the scoreboard. And he wasn't done, not even close. Remington took that GT40 into the wind tunnel like he was sculpting it by hand, shaving down that chunky front end, smoothing the airflow, and giving the car a cleaner punch through the wind. He smoothed out the front, tightened up the rear so it wouldn't dance around at crazy speeds, and went through the whole car fixing little weak spots that like to snap when things got wild. He cleaned up the wiring, shaved weight wherever he could, and rearranged things so the crew could reach everything without crawling through a jungle of parts. Remington understood better than anyone that the real fight wasn't just out on the asphalt. It was happening right there in the pit lane, where seconds could decide legends. Meanwhile, Ken Miles, Shelby's go-to wheelman, was out there beating on these cars like they owed him money. Day after day, he pushed them past sane limits. Parts blew apart, then he drove harder the next run, and between him and Remington something unspoken formed. Miles tore the car down with speed, Remington built it back up with skill. Miles would roll in with the GT40 rattling itself to pieces, climb out drenched in sweat, and Remington would already be waiting with tools in hand like he'd been expecting the exact failure. That bond, one breaking, one fixing, quietly became the backbone of Ford's whole operation. Miles exposed the cracks. Remington sealed them, and together they forged the GT40 into a monster, a mix of brute force, razor-sharp tuning, and pure stubbornness that refused to quit. But upstairs, in the tidy boardrooms far away from grease and grinding metal, the executives were still uneasy. The screw-ups from earlier years hung over them like ghosts. They dumped millions into this dream and trophies still weren't showing up. But Shelby's crew, beat up and laser-focused, knew they were right on the edge. And Remington, the calm craftsman nobody outside the garage even knew, had built the exact tools they needed to finally finish the job. As the sky dimmed over Daytona and the GT40s tore around the track in their last big tests, sparks shot from the glowing brake pads like fireworks. Remington stood at the pit wall with his arms folded, eyes glued to every lap. No cheering, no grinning, just that steady look of someone who already knows how the story ends. He could see the shift, chaos turning into control, brute strength turning into something balanced and deadly. The GT40 wasn't just a race car anymore. It was an American-made weapon, shaped quietly, hardened by failures, and sharpened by one man's relentless mind. And in the background, away from the noise and the cameras, the guy who helped make it all possible was already preparing for the battle ahead. The road to Le Mans stretched forward like a challenge thrown in their faces, a path lined with fire, speed, and the kind of pressure that breaks lesser teams. The road ahead looked like it was carved out of danger and destiny, but right there in that moment, under the buzz of engines and the warm glow bouncing off metal and tools, one thing was crystal clear. Without Phil Remington, Ford wouldn't have even rolled up to the start line. He wasn't just a crew guy, he was the quiet weapon everyone trusted, even if the outside world had no clue who he was. His first major genius move, the brake setup. The stuff the UK guys originally designed just couldn't hang with the sheer muscle and weight of that American V8. Those brakes would get cooked, fade out, and basically stop caring right when the car was flying toward the end of a 200 mph straight. And that's not oops territory, that's pray and hope you survive. So who stepped up and turned the whole situation on its head? Remington. Working out of Shelby American's gritty Lowe's Angels shop, he took this rough, half-baked idea and turned it into something that looked like it belonged in a museum, the quick-swap brake system. And this wasn't some tiny tweak, this flipped the entire strategy. Ferrari's guys took whole minutes to change their brakes. Remington's creation, Shelby's crew could pop new pads in before the Italians even finished grabbing their tools. It was built like a pit lane weapon, fast, tough, and stupidly efficient. But brakes alone wouldn't get them to the promised land. They needed a heart that could take the abuse. Enter the 7-liter Ford V8, the beast folks called the side oiler because of the way it handled its oiling system. On paper, it was a monster. In real life, it was moody. It blew up, overheated, starved itself of oil, basically acted like a ticking grenade. Remington and the mechanics didn't just drop it into the car and shrug. They treated it like a living thing. They smoothed out the oiling problems, beefed up parts that cracked, fixed cooling issues, and kept tuning it until it acted like the engine they knew it could be. The drivers ended up falling in love with it. Dan Gurney himself once said that big Ford motor felt less like an engine and more like a promise, something you could trust when the world tried to shake you apart. That engine had so much grunt it felt like it was trying to pull the whole world behind it. You could shift early, baby it, or smash the throttle, and it just kept dragging you forward like nothing could slow it down. It started life as a tough workhorse motor, but Remington and the crew transformed it into something that behaved like a wild race stallion. Ken Miles once joked, or more like warned, that the thing wasn't gentle or fancy at all. It hit like a hammer. You didn't finesse it, you simply pointed it where you wanted to go and let it loose. In the shop, the guys had their own nickname for the Remington-tuned version. They called it the Iron Horse, a nod to just how ridiculous its durability became. This engine wasn't just powerful, it was dependable in a way that almost felt unfair. And that reliability only existed because Remington had gone over it piece by piece, coaxing all the weakness out of it. Then came the 24-hour showdown, a place where cars either earn their legend or die trying. For Ford, this wasn't just some corporate grudge match anymore. The GT40 project had consumed everyone involved. Upper management wanted payback, headlines, bragging rights, but the people in the trenches, Shelby, Miles, Remington, understood the truth. Speed alone wouldn't win against Ferrari. They needed stamina, brains, and a machine that could survive a day-long fight with no mercy. In the paddock, the atmosphere crackled. European teams watched the Americans like they were some loud circus rolling into town. Ferrari showed up with their bright red machines looking sleek, confident, almost smug. Ford's GT40s, by comparison, seemed oversized and brutal, loud, thick-bodied, unapologetically American. But hidden beneath that tough exterior was Remington's craftsmanship, a car engineered to keep breathing long after others tapped out. Remington wasn't interested in fame or cameras. While people smiled for photos, he was already under the car with a torque wrench, working by instinct. His hands moved fast and calm, picking out problems before anyone else even knew they existed. He'd studied every inch of the machine so thoroughly that he could have rebuilt it from scratch without looking. The night before the race, Miles wandered over to where Remington was finishing up. They didn't say much, just stood there listening to the metal cool and tick. Eventually, Miles nudged the silence. "Think she'll make it?" he asked quietly. Remington didn't speak. He just laid a hand on the fender like he was checking a heartbeat, took a second and gave a single nod, not to Miles but almost to the car itself. And then the moment arrived. The crowd roared, engines thundered awake, and the green flag dropped. Le Mans had begun. The second that flag dropped, the whole countryside lit up with this thunder that felt like it was shaking the dirt under everyone's shoes. The Ferraris jumped out front looking all fancy and polished, but the GT40s, man, those things came out screaming like they were trying to punch the air out of the sky. But Remington wasn't watching the show on the track, he was glued to the readouts, the pulse of the beast he'd spent months perfecting. Lap after lap, those Fords just kept hammering. The brakes, his pride and joy, were holding up like they were carved out of granite. Every time other teams crawled into the pits for surgery, the GT40s slid in, got their parts swapped, and blasted back out before you even finished a breath. His quick change setup was working like some kind of pit lane cheat code. By midnight, the track looked like a scrapyard in motion. Blown engines, dying gearboxes, teams pushing cars that gave up on life. But Ford's black and gold monsters kept ripping through the night like nothing could touch them. Every pit stop looked choreographed. Remington's guys weren't even moving fast so much as moving right, every tweak, turn, and pull exactly where he trained them to be. He'd engineered the whole car to be serviced under pressure. Bolts spaced wide for gloves, fasteners sitting at the perfect angle, parts laid out like a color-coded map only his crew could truly read. This wasn't clever design, this was war strategy. Meanwhile, Ferrari started melting down, brakes fatting, engines wheezing, pit stops dragging on forever. Ford was gaining full minutes just by being smarter. And Remington? He stood on the pit wall like a statue in the middle of a hurricane, face calm, eyes locked on the track, reading the vibrations under his boots and the tone of every passing engine like he had some sixth sense for machinery. When the sun finally cracked over Le Mans, the only cars still running strong were the Fords, his Fords. And inside the lead GT40, Miles was putting on a masterclass. The man wasn't driving, he was communicating with the machine, feeling every twitch and hum like it was talking back. He trusted what Remington built without question. Near the end, when Miles radioed in about a weird vibration, Remington already had the fix in his head before the car even hit the pit box. One tweak, one quick swap, and the GT40 shot back out like it had never complained in the first place. The GT40 fired back onto the course like it hadn't missed a beat. Almost like the car and Miles were sharing the same brain cell, he could sense every whisper the machine made, and Remington could cure any problem it threw at him. As the laps wound down, the scoreboard was basically flexing on the whole field. Ford was sitting 1-2-3, a clean sweep nobody thought was possible. Ferrari didn't get beaten by brute strength, they got dismantled by planning, by Remington's obsession with tightening every weak point and stress testing every single thing that could break. His quick swap brakes, the beefed-up pieces, the endless late-night tinkering, all of it had turned into the skeleton that kept those cars alive. But even a night full of victory had room for one nasty surprise. The big showdown had been brutal from the start, Ferrari dancing around with finesse, Ford pushing back with muscle, but as darkness settled in, Remington's fingerprints started showing. Every pit stop was clean. Every brake swap was perfect. Seconds turned into minutes and the Ferrari started folding under the pressure, their machines giving up the ghost. Then right when Ford looked untouchable, the radio cracked with bad news from Miles, a weird shake, a shudder, something that wasn't right. The corporate tech guys freaked out, throwing around guesses like broken transmissions and dying diffs. But Remington just stood there, listening, recognizing the noise instantly from earlier torture testing sessions. He knew it wasn't catastrophic, just a fatigued mount he'd reinforced once but knew could still buckle if pushed too far. Instead of sprinting, he walked up with this calm, laser-focused energy, already holding the exact wrench and the heavier replacement bracket he'd welded up just in case. Miles slid in, Remington dove underneath, and in barely more than a minute the fix was done. The GT40 shot back into the darkness like it had been resurrected. That tiny moment, the quiet save only a few people even noticed, was the real battle won long before the trophy was handed out. Even though the drivers got the glory, the real war was won by a guy with a wrench, and then came the final heart-sinking twist. Ford had the win locked, but the executives wanted a picture-perfect PR moment. They told Ken Miles to ease off the gas, taking away his hard-earned solo victory. Bruce McLaren's car, which had started farther back, ended up getting the official win. Miles, the guy who had poured everything into that car, got robbed. And Phil Remington, the silent genius who had built the machine that carried them to the finish, didn't even make the headlines. The two men who mattered most quietly watched as the champagne sprayed elsewhere. As the last hours ticked down, the higher-ups demanded a staged photo finish. Miles had to slow so all three GT40s could cross together. They wanted that historic image, a triple win showing off American dominance. Miles complied, holding back despite leading the entire race. The cars rolled across the line side by side, cameras flashing, Ford immortalized in history, but the results told a different story. Because McLaren and Ammon's car had started farther back, it technically covered more distance. Miles, the man who'd been out front nearly the whole time, didn't get the win. He climbed out of the cockpit, hiding his disappointment behind a faint smile and sheer exhaustion. Around him, the paddock erupted with celebration. Meanwhile, Remington stayed in the shadows, face unreadable. He knew what was lost, not just a trophy, but recognition for the guys who actually made it happen. Photographers and executives mobbed Shelby, Ford, and the drivers for photos. Remington quietly disappeared to the back of the garage, wiping oil from his hands, cleaning his tools. Glory didn't matter to him. What mattered was that the car survived, endured, and proved itself. Fireworks exploded over Le Mans, crowds cheered, cameras clicked, but underneath all the headlines and champagne, one fact remained undeniable. The real victory was forged in grease, sweat, and steel in the hands of Phil Remington. He had built the beating heart of a legend. He had built the weapon that crushed Ferrari, and yet the world barely gave him a whisper. Papers were filled with stories of Ford's triumph, but the guy who actually engineered it, already fading into the shadows. The forgotten builder. The morning after Le Mans, the headlines were everywhere, but Phil Remington's name was absent. While executives toasted in fancy Paris hotels, he was back in the garage, sleeves rolled up, scrubbing the grime from the GT40's intakes, inspecting every bolt and hose. For him, the race didn't end at the checkered flag. It ended only when every piece had been examined, every weak point understood, every lesson extracted. That was just how he rolled, always moving forward, never pausing to admire the chaos of victory. Fame didn't matter. The cameras that had hovered over the roaring machines were now glued to Ford's smiling board members, packaging the triumph as corporate glory. America proving it could outmuscle old-world Europe. But beneath that shine was the hand of one man, precise, obsessive, relentless. Shelby knew it, Ken Miles knew it, every pit mechanic knew it. Without Phil Remington, there would have been no finish, let alone a 1-2-3 sweep. History, of course, is written by those with the photos, the headlines, and the speeches. Perfection carries a quiet cost. Back in California, Remington slipped into Shelby American, the next challenge already waiting. Ford wanted faster, lighter, stronger, and Remington was ready. The GT program evolved into the Mk3, the Mk4, each one demanding engineering miracles, each one calling for the same ruthless focus. And Phil's method? Simple. Measure, test, refine, repeat until the impossible worked like clockwork. Test, tweak, repeat, that was his rhythm. His workshop turned into a shrine for practical genius. Folks would haul him busted parts, and without a single blueprint, he'd fix them purely by feel, intuition guiding every move. He could glance at a piece of metal and tell you exactly where it would snap, warp, or give out under heat, torque, or sheer punishment. People said Phil didn't say much, but when he did, every word hit like it carried decades of hard-earned truth. Ask him once how he built machines that could survive anything, and he just shrugged. I make sure nothing can go wrong, and if it does, I make sure it's easy to fix. Simple words, but that was the core of endurance racing, not chasing beauty or raw speed but chasing resilience, the kind of mechanical faith that could survive 24 hours of chaos. A quiet revolution in grease and steel. Even after Ford's triumphs, Remington never slowed down. He helped craft the Shelby Daytona Coupe, tuned the Cobra, and later joined Dan Gurney's All-American Racers, leaving fingerprints that shaped decades of racing innovation. Anything that needed to go faster, last longer, or survive punishment called for Phil. He built everything from Indy race cars to airplanes, even experimental machines NASA poked at. Every project carried his mark, precise, simple, flawless. He was one of the rare engineers who could turn chaos into order, spot patterns in failure, and find beauty in the mechanical soul of speed. Yet through it all, his name stayed deliberately in the background. Journalists chasing heroes found the drivers, sponsors hunting for faces found the executives. Phil Remington stayed in the shadows not because he was forgotten but because he never wanted the spotlight. He let the machines and the victories speak for themselves. But mostly because that's just how he liked it. Remington's legacy? It's all over the machines that made history. This unsung genius left his fingerprints on some of the most iconic cars ever built. He was key to the Shelby Daytona Coupe that beat Ferrari in '65, he engineered the AC Cobra, and later at Dan Gurney's All-American Racers, he designed and built the Eagle Indy car that took victory in '73. His skills even reached into aerospace. If something needed fixing, making faster, or surviving harder, Phil was the man. He worked right up until 2013, a king in the garage, even if the history books treated him like a ghost. The Ford versus Ferrari rivalry. Yeah, that got all the headlines and Hollywood dramatization. But the deeper, truer fight was always between the soul of racing, guys like Remington and Miles, and the business of racing, with its executives and photo ops. In '66, the suits got the glory, but the soul ran the race. Decades later, Ford versus Ferrari became a movie myth, sleek posters, star-studded casts, exaggerated rivalries. Shelby and Miles got the spotlight, sure, but any mechanic who lived it, any racer who felt the truth will tell you this: Phil Remington was the backbone, not flashy, never seeking applause, but pure substance. While Ford's glory faded and Ferrari rebuilt, Remington was still in the trenches, sleeves rolled, grease under his nails, making the next thing better. He kept at it until his hands couldn't grip a wrench anymore. Even in his late 80s, he was measuring, fabricating, thinking no classroom or degree had taught him. He learned from metal, sweat, and instinct, and the machines he touched still whisper his genius. No textbook could ever teach what Phil Remington knew. He was self-taught, self-made, and always chasing the next problem to solve. A true American craftsman from a breed that's almost gone. When he passed in 2013, the racing world just paused. That kind of quiet that hits only for legends whose names most fans don't even know. Teams all over the globe stopped to honor him. Drivers, mechanics, engineers swapping stories. How he once stayed up 3 straight nights to get a car ready, how he could sketch a part with no blueprint and make it perfect, how his fixes looked almost too simple to be genius, until you realized that simplicity was the revolution itself. He lived through racing's evolution, from hand-forged metal to carbon fiber, from gut instinct to computers. But one thing never changed: races are still won or lost by the people who build the cars. And in that sense, Phil Remington, forever undefeated, the ghost in the machine. Every GT40 replica, every endurance prototype, every team chasing perfection carries the faint whisper of his work. His mindset, relentless innovation, quiet mastery, human precision became the invisible heartbeat of modern motorsport. Glory was never his goal. His victory was endurance itself. And that leaves us with the haunting question: what if Phil Remington hadn't been in that garage? What if the quick change brakes had stayed just a napkin sketch? What if the Iron Horse engine had never been perfected? Money wasn't the limit for Ford, and Shelby's charisma could move mountains, but without Remington's genius, would it have been enough? Or would the GT40 have stayed a beautiful, broken promise? The shocking truth: Phil Remington didn't just build the car that won Le Mans. Without him, Ford's biggest triumph could have been its most expensive disaster. So what do you think? Could Ford have beat Ferrari without that quiet man in the shadows? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. This is Paul from Cars Prompt. Catch you next time.